Welcome to our second edition of the Northview Reads podcast. This one's going to go out February 1st, and we're going to talk about the scriptures that we're going to be reading in the coming months and talk a little bit about the reflections of what we have read in January. So my name's Crystal. I'm the pastor of discipleship at Northview Community Church in Abbotsford, and I'm joined by three other pastors who have been part of this Bible reading plan with me. So I'm going to get you to introduce yourselves. So Dolly, start off with you.
I'm Dolly. I am the missions pastor. Yep. What else am I supposed to say?
That's fine.
Okay.
You can start with that. Yeah. Freddie.
My name is Freddie. I'm a pastor of young adults, and I love Bible reading, so they invited me.
Oh, yes, I love
this
it
plan.
too.
Excellent. Jesse?
And I'm Jesse. I'm the community groups pastor, involved in men's ministry as well. And I'm here because I like being on podcasts with Freddie.
We have lots of things to discuss.
Freddie is the big draw for all of us here.
More than the
probably
Bible.
not.
Freddie.
Sanctification, knowing God.
No, we got to keep him on
fun
track.
personalities.
So,
Yeah, totally.
You know, if you're listening to this, that we've done a lot of work to keep him on track already, just to get this thing started.
Oh,
So
the WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the WhatsApp.
we'll start there.
No.
So for those of you who don't know, we are doing a chronological read through the Bible plan this year at Northview. And we have a paper and pen version that people actually have to read through the Bible in their own Bible, not an electronic version, which has caused some kerfuffle, although we have some options coming up for that. And then we also have a WhatsApp group where people can post their comments on what they're reading. And so we thought we'd just, before we get into reflections on the Bible, talk about how has this been going so far? What have you guys experienced and noticed online or in person with people talking about the plan? Jump in.
Well, definitely there was a lot of kerfuffle, as you said, a lot of conversation at the beginning not related to the text as
Yeah.
people were getting used to the platform. Definitely died down and more focused, but I think it's been good. Some people's comments are awesome. I love it.
Yeah. You notice, Freddie, like your young adult group is like very much into everything electronic. And so
Yes.
the fact that we didn't have an app for this was kind of threw some people, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think, so for the record, I did email YouVersion, and I asked if they would let us be content creators, like as Northview,
Yeah.
and I just never heard back. So I imagine they get all kinds of requests. So that had been tried. So I think maybe we could have communicated a little bit better that the WhatsApp group is a messaging platform. Like it has no involvement with, no integration, if you will, with the Bible. But the young adults are already reading on their phone. So I think most of them were willing to just switch back and forth between apps because they do anyways, right? If you've ever been around a young adult, you know, like they got their B-reel and then they're texting and then they're watching something on Instagram or tweeting something. Like it's very normal. So I think in kind of as we rolled it out, you could see a little bit of a disparity between kind of age brackets and how they're using it. But by God's grace, we seem to have been past it, and now it's just Bible, which is that's the goal, right? We should be
that's right.
talking about the Bible, not how to talk about the Bible.
And if people have questions on it, like I said a couple times in the group chat, just email us at discipleship@northview.org, and we'll help set up any kind of technical stuff we need. But yeah, it's been going well. We have 164 people on the WhatsApp group. We have maybe 10 or 12 regular kind of contributors. What kind of thoughts do you guys have about how to contribute? What would be a good way to contribute? Is our goal to have all 164 contribute? Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, for me, I'd want to make sure there's an invitation to contribute, regardless of how many others already have. And
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe one of the impressions that might be out there is like, I'm going to comment something in a group of people. Largely, I maybe don't even know them personally. Some of them are pastors. Do I have something meaningful to, like, how many times do I need to proofread this before I post it
Exactly.
and don't look like kind of dumb? And it's like,
Put it through Grammarly.
Like, yeah. No punctuation errors. No, like, I think there's just an invitation. Like, if you've got a question about, the text, maybe that's all it is. I don't know what this means. Somebody weigh in on this. Like, it doesn't have to be like, this every single time, like, you have to sound like you had 7 paragraphs that, like, wow, like that put Freddie in his place. Like it doesn't.
Dunked on that guy. Take that.
Yeah. So just that would be one thing for me is like, the invitation is there for everybody to jump in and participate.
Mm-hmm. I found surprising some people's comments on like just good questions they've had, like, how do we understand Elihu in Job, right? Like he's the only one that doesn't get chastised by God. Why is that? Is that because, as some commentators will say, well, he's was too young, he didn't even deserve a chastisement, or some people will say because he was partly speaking truth, right? So there's been some good questions and some really thoughtful things that people have posted.
Yep.
Yeah.
Some surprises too, like, oh, this person has some good content. So really good, thoughts people have written.
Yeah. And then there's just been a lot of encouragement of people giving thumbs up or hearts or whatever.
Yeah,
to
yeah.
like, that resonated with me too,
Yeah.
or those kind of things. So,
Well, and honestly, that's my favorite part. Like when I had one this morning, well, I guess it dated, but like the 30th,
Of
today's
January,
29th,
yeah.
29th of January. And when you see someone else see the same thing that you did, like it's a very like powerful confirming experience where I'm like, I think confidence is a challenge for most of us when we read the Bible because all of us have a favorite Bible teacher and we're like, I could never talk or read or understand like him or like her, and I'm like, I don't want to post, right? And then you post something and you're like, well, I hope it was good, right? And you're like, well, the point wasn't that I'm posting, right? The point was that I read, right? And then you see another person, another Christian filled by the Spirit, and they're like, dude, I saw the same thing. So that is my favorite part when I'm like, not because I mean, it's nice to be agreed with, I guess. But when multiple Christian people are saying the same thing and taking away the same thing from a text, that it's more likely that it was there. And it's a powerful reminder that God uses the mundane practice of, 10, 15 minutes a day. Like most people maybe have a quiet time, but not all of them. Like I got little kids, so like sometimes my son joins me as we read and holds the highlighter, and I tell him don't bump me, and he proceeds to bump me. So I have squiggly highlighter marks in my Bible, but that's the spiritual formation of just regular Bible reading that over a lifetime like shapes people in powerful ways.
I just wanted to say too, I really appreciated the gentle nudging of this moving away from the YouVersion app to me opening my Bible again, because I found it easy to listen to scripture on the app and then I would be distracted with something else. But now I'm being more focused in actually reading and highlighting and, oh, I read that yesterday, it's right there instead of going backwards in my app, things like that, and actually writing things down. So for me personally, it's just helped me be more focused. So I know some people love to listen as they drive and they commute, and so it makes sense. I don't have a far commute, so I have to be intentional to sit down and read and write, and I've appreciated that for myself. So
yeah. So we have had some people in the congregation when they kind of saw that people were really wanting that version of the online or audio version. Some people stepped up and said, well, I can produce that for people. And so we've actually, if you go onto the website now, Richard McKenzie and Martin Knauber have kind of given us links to a Logos Bible reading app, or like it links into like a reading program that can open on Logos. And then Richard did one for ESV audio. So people can go now for the February plan and they can do the audio link every day and read it that way. So,
but it's not in WhatsApp.
It's not in WhatsApp.
Not. You access it through the website. Okay,
yeah.
did everyone hear that? Yeah. Through the website?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. But
Please don't chat me. Don't message me.
It'll give the option
Yeah.
for people that specifically want to listen on audio.
Yeah.
So I think it's good. I love the fact that people in the congregation just kind of stood up and said, hey, well, I can help out with that, because we didn't have a YouVersion app. So that was a great win as a team moment for congregants that way. So what we're going to do is spend the next couple of minutes just looking back on what we have read, and then we're going to look forward to what we will be reading. So in this last month, we've read Genesis 1 to 35. Well, we'll finish 34 and 35, I guess, tomorrow. We have read Job, and we read Matthew 1 to 20. So Jesse, talk us through Genesis 1 to 35. What have been kind of some highlights, some review pieces for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love that we're doing the whole Bible. First of all, like just take you back to texts that maybe you haven't been in a while, or perhaps ever in some cases. But one of the things that struck me going back to these early chapters of the Bible, specifically in Genesis, was like how many things are just foundational to the rest of the story from that point on.
Totally, yeah.
I've been having more conversations with one of my kids, my 7-year-old, and he'll ask anything about anything he's heard in kids' church or wherever. And as I'm responding to him, and I was thinking about this in the car ride, even this morning, as he was asking me some questions, like almost every question he's asked, I'm required to pull back from content in Genesis to shape an answer for him. And so there's so many things that right from the start help us to get the story right from the start. So that you have stuff about like how did we get here? Like why is there evil in the world? Like why does things just seem so chaotic and messed up? Like, is this how it was always supposed to be? And all those sorts of things, and just the usefulness of going back to that to get us set on the right course for the rest of the story, and not just to understand the story at a conceptual level, but like this is where we're going to have to draw from if we're going to answer people's real big questions as we seek to help them know God and know his story. So yeah, it's been really encouraging. I mean, I could go off forever about just stuff about the covenants, like just Genesis 12,
more.
Genesis 15,
Tell me
like
more.
those, like just profound to see like God's heart and what he is going to do to accomplish his purposes. So just other little highlights like that have been great.
Yeah, like we had mentioned on our last podcast, Genesis 12, 15, 17, the covenant God makes with Abraham is basically what then kind of pushes the whole story through the whole Old Testament. Like, how is God going to bless the whole world through this person who eventually becomes a nation of Israel,
Yeah.
who eventually Jesus comes through? Like, so that's kind of a thread that once you know those promises, they come up over and over and over again. Like they came up again in Genesis 26 to Isaac, and then they'll come up again to Jacob, and they just keep coming up, and God keeps reaffirming and developing them as the Old Testament goes. So yeah, those are huge. How about Job, Freddie? Anything you want to say about Job?
Yes. I had a couple of conversations with young adults who were like, buddy, 40 chapters, 42 chapters. Like, it was good. It was good. And like, it was, right? But I'm like, if you weren't in a Bible reading plan, like whether chronological or, the more thematic, like you wouldn't read probably, like you would read Job 1 and 2 and maybe a full, like, maybe to chapter 8, 7, and then you skip a bunch until you get to 38, and then you read 38 to 42, and then you're like, okay, yeah, 42, the God the Father, Yahweh dunks on them, and, everyone stay in your lane. The end. Because it is repetitive, right? And I was super encouraged to see kind of that dialogue in the group chat on Elihu. Like, it is that's one of the big questions in the book. Like, how should we understand the dialogue between the characters? And I talked to my wife about it a couple of times where I'm like, she's like, they're really like, they give strong theological answers. Like they're outlining like the doctrine of total depravity. Like everyone sins. So the book is kind of awkward in like, it's very repetitive. The bad guys, quote unquote, say right
Some good things.
Yeah. Well, lots of good things, right?
Yeah.
Like I guess in the end, I think like, in terms of how I understand the book, like the error is that they give a black and white answer. You are suffering because you sinned, and I'm like, you can't say that. Like we don't know. Like they are putting themselves in the place of God, which is why they get rebuked, I think. And Elihu says very similar things, but he never teaches causation. Like he never attributes Job's suffering to his own wickedness. He simply advocates for the character of God. And this harmonizes really well with John chapter 9, where you have the man born blind, and the disciples ask a very similar question to Jesus, like, who sinned, this man or his parents, right? Because all suffering comes from sin. And I'm like, well, that is a true theological statement if you mean all suffering originates in Adam's first sin and then, is passed along through his progenitors. What is it called? What's the word? I don't know. I'm ESL, so it doesn't matter. Shouldn't have used the word. Progeny, whatever. The number of people who came after him. But
yeah, in the sense that if we were in the garden still, there would be no suffering.
Totally.
But whether it's related to a specific particular sin.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm like, and I think just empirically, none of us truly believe that every bad thing in our life is caused by our sin, or we would never have good things. All of us sin, right? Like that's foundational to Christian theology. So the book is a great, a very drawn out example, if you will, of having good theology but terrible practice, right? We're trying to give an answer where sometimes you don't really need to, or maybe only give the answer that people ask you to answer. And so in that way, I thought the book was a great, it was a great read. It was repetitive. I fully admit that. But again, I only read the whole book because it was in the reading plan. And if it was up to me, I probably would have skipped a few chapters, right? And I'm grateful that all of us read through. We had good dialogue. That's what makes it fun, I think.
Yeah, poetry is kind of an uncommon literature style for us, right? We don't generally plow through that. And then to go through a bunch, like 3 chapters at a time, it feels like it's different than reading 3 chapters of story. And then it's like 3 chapters of dialogue around theology. So
well, they say the same thing. Like, you sinned. And I'm like, okay, it's because you kept back your hands from the poor. I'm like, okay, so he definitely did. Like, do you not know that God is righteous? I'm like, yes, I believe that. And you drink iniquity like water. I'm like, okay, I think that's also true. So like it's full. Like Job would be a great book to preach through, like all those middle chapters in like one liner. Here's what we learn about who God is. Here's what we learn about human sin. It's a terrible book to preach through, and like this is what causes suffering, because that's why they get rebuked. We don't know.
Yeah, so Job is a good antidote to prosperity gospel kind of teaching, right?
For sure.
Because they're basically, a lot of that would be similar to like our worldly advice, like you put good into the universe, you're going to get good back. And Job's story is like he put all kinds of good into the universe and had lots of suffering. And so we can't expect this kind of yin and yang world that everything that we do, if we're quote unquote good people, is going to result in good for us. So we're at the mercy of this fallen world, regardless of what we do and who we believe in. Not at the mercy, but we're in this fallen world, relying on God in the midst of it. So, yeah, Matthew, what would you have to tell us, Dolly, about what we've done in Matthew?
Well, it's been fun to go back into Matthew as a participant also of the Matthew Bible studies, because it's just bringing back, because last time we were in Matthew was like a year ago. So bringing that back and bringing the context back in.
Yeah.
And so these first 20 chapters is really the progression of his life from birth to getting ready for his ministry, and then his discourses, his speeches. And then we're going to jump into like the last week of his life in the next month. So it's really just a good start of the Gospels in general, and then in the life of Christ from the beginning on. So
it's been encouraging for me to see, oftentimes you're reading something in the Old Testament and then something Jesus does kind of connects that. Like you see, like even today, right? We see in Matthew 20 or 19, it was the story of God giving the workers the same kind of amount of money, depending on not dependent on when they started during the day, right? And so we see this, the laborers in the vineyard. So we see this like his amazing grace, and then we go back to Genesis and we see like his amazing grace towards Jacob, who was kind of shyster and deceiver and all these things. And you see like both those things are playing out in different ways. And
complaining about all the years of labor and not being, compensated for it.
Yeah,
right?
and yet he's coming back to his land with like all these crops and family and so just seeing those ideas kind of paralleled in the Old Testament text and the New Testament text. So looking ahead, we are going to read Genesis 36 to 50. So finish the book of Genesis, then we're going to read all of Exodus and start into Leviticus. So Genesis 36 to 50. As people prep to read that, Jesse, what kind of things should they keep in mind? What are they going to encounter?
Yeah, well, I think it's been helpful that we got to go back to Genesis after taking a little bit of a break in Job. So obviously we can lean on some of the context, kind of follow the story as it goes, because we're going to continue with this family. We're going to continue with the descendants of Abraham. I was thinking about we're not going to be there for that many days in the month, and a large part of that time is going to be spent with the character of Joseph and just this immense betrayal, injustice from within his own family, and what he goes through for the next several years, and thinking through like to watch for, okay, on the one hand you have the activity of these human characters, some make some really bad choices, evil choices, and Joseph kind of is impacted by these choices at every turn, and I'm just trying to think through it, as we're reading this nowadays. We're reading a story that seems maybe disconnected from our experience. We all have our own individual responsibilities, pressures, all these different things in life, and it can sometimes feel like, okay, well, how does what I'm going through relate to the larger story of God? And this is what I'm trying to like anticipate watching in Joseph, is he's got all these different things happening in his individual story, and in the background this whole time, God is doing something, working towards his good purposes, as he has been doing since Genesis 3 and moving forward. But you get to this point at the end of the book, and it's like he has this perspective, like, okay, everything that happened to me, man meant these certain things for evil, but God meant them for good. And as we see that as a case study in Joseph, I hope we can kind of view our own lives in the same way, post Jesus, now going like, okay, we know, places like Romans 8 that all things are going to work together for good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so to try to keep in mind that, like, we, even if we don't understand over the even years, like Joseph is in this scenario for years, and it's like there's no immediate quick fix. There's no immediate like, God, show me the good you are working out of this, and maybe that for some of us who are participating in this plan, going like, I relate. I haven't seen some good for a while, and there's no way it seems like God could possibly be working something in here. Just to be reminded again, don't get bogged down in the activities of these human characters, but try to keep in mind that there's a God in the background at times, more in the background than it seems like he's even around, that is still moving, still working, still faithful to move his good purposes forward. And so I'm looking forward to revisiting that story and how that can be helpful for us today.
Yeah, like it says specifically, like Joseph was in prison and God was with him, right? And we think so often when we're in those dark, hard places, God isn't with us or God's abandoned us, but it says, and God was with him and God made his hand prosper. And he was in there until the right time for him to be appointed to prime minister. But that was a long time, right? So sometimes we have to wait in these seasons of waiting until God's purposes, and he does stuff in our character and in our own lives in the midst of that waiting for his deliverance. But it can be long, but it doesn't mean God's not with us in the midst of those hard times.
Totally. And one of the things that is kind of interesting in going from Job then back to Genesis is you kind of have like two sources of suffering, right? You have a supernatural opponent and this adversary character, the Satan, right? And then now in people, right? And like that's a Christian experience, right? You have opposition from a supernatural being that wants you to suffer and wants to take away your satisfaction in the Lord, your comfort in salvation. And you also hurt from people, or sometimes our own bad decisions. So it's cool to see as we work through the book, like it's a pretty good kind of summary of Christian life. Like we suffer because of people, we suffer because of Satan, we suffer because of our own bad choices, right? And in all of it, though, that great hope is God is still working, right? We mean it for evil, Satan meant it for evil, they meant it for evil, God means it for good, right? In Genesis 50. So something to look forward to for people who may be hurting or maybe are hoping to not be hurting. So good stuff in the book for sure.
Yeah. So we end the book of Genesis with Joseph's whole family. So like Jacob and all the brothers moving down into Egypt. And then the book of Exodus enters.
400
start,
years later.
Well, a couple hundred years later, it says that the Pharaoh that was now in place didn't remember Joseph, and this nation has grown into a couple 100,000 people. If you look at numbers later on in the text, and they're enslaved and they're being treated harshly, and we start right away with the story of Moses. And Exodus is this great story of deliverance, of God saving his people, remembering these promises to Abraham. Like it says specifically, like God remembered his promises and he saw the suffering and he knew what they were going and he decided to act. And so again, a great picture into who God is in the midst of human suffering. And so the first 15 chapters or so are of that, kind of describing that scenario of the suffering that they were in, and Moses being called then to be the deliverer, and Moses coming and the 10 plagues. And then Exodus 14, they go through the Red Sea, which most of us who kind of have been in Bible studies or in Sunday school should know that story. And then it's a whole bunch of wandering through the wilderness and getting the law and getting instructions on the tabernacle, kind of God's instructions for how to be faithful to this God that delivered them, what it looks like to live as his people. There's descriptions about kind of the nation of Israel as God's royal priesthood and holy nation, which are pictures that come up throughout the Bible of how we're supposed to kind of conduct ourselves as God's people. So there's so much foundational ideas and imagery in the book of Exodus that if you just read it as kind of flannel graph stories, you don't really see. But if you look at some of the, like, as you read some of these phrases in Exodus, like God revealing himself to Moses in Exodus 33-ish, where he talks about him, being a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, like that. Those four little phrases come up over and over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament and New Testament, talking about the character of God. So just super foundational pieces. We also have the golden calf story, kind of in the middle of, we have like the giving of the law, and then in the middle of the giving of the law and God giving Moses instructions on how the people should worship, God says, like, go down there back to the people because they're making a mess of things. And so we have their first like real big punishment from God. And again, we see a picture of God's mercy and grace towards this people that don't deserve it because they have so quickly turned away from him and turned to worshiping idols. And so I had to do one of my very first classes at Regent we had to finish off our course by doing like a visual representation of a book, and I did one of Exodus. And I basically just had the words "I am" on the page, and then fit the whole book of Exodus into those
Wow,
two
that's cool.
words, because that's what it is. It's all about God introducing himself to these people that don't really know him, who he is, his character, his deliverance, his salvation, what it looks like to worship him, what it looks like to follow him. And we did it as a Bible study, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. And I was talking to a gentleman from the men's Bible study in the hallway just at Christmas time. And he said he still got kind of emotional. He said how much he loved Moses and how sad he was to leave him at the end of the book of Exodus. Because it was just, you get this heart for this guy that's trying to lead these hundreds of thousands of people through the wilderness, being opposed at every turn.
Yeah.
And the book ends, spoiler alert, but the book ends with Moses kind of on the top of the mountain. They've constructed this tabernacle for worship, and God's Spirit just descends on it with such power that they're all pushed out of this and are just in awe of this God that they worship. And so it's this beautiful picture of him rescuing his people and showing them how to worship him and who he is. So as you read Exodus, just look for a lot of those pieces about his character, his nature, and what he's calling his people to do and how they should live.
Amen.
I like that
Yeah.
word. I like that word awe. Like that's if you're feeling like, oh, like where is, you lost maybe that sense of wonder over who God is, and you're just so familiar with these stories. And it's like, try to sit back and just try to absorb again. Like, wow, like this could put you in a position of awe, having gone through it again. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, even the Mount Sinai, kind of with the law coming down, it's just like this picture of like this mountain trembling and smoke and trumpets, and like God's trying to impress upon them how great of a God he is. So, and then we go from there to Leviticus,
Yes.
which is what, Freddie,
Yes.
what are you going to tell us
I
about
love it.
Leviticus?
Well, actually, I'll kind of follow suit what you're saying. So if Exodus is I am, then Leviticus is kind of like you are. God is telling his people, here's like, this is what it means to be in a relationship with me. When I said, you're my royal priesthood, in Exodus 6:7, like this is what life together looks like. And you have like the passage, or I guess the chunk that we get is a bunch of sacrifices, probably for the first like 8 chapters. Like here's how you give a peace offering, and eventually you get to the guilt offering in chapter 16, and there's some narrative mixed in of like some rebellion, unfortunately. But like the book of Leviticus we mostly talk about it when people will quote either sarcastically or like genuinely, like the kind of Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, like on sexual ethics. But I'm like, that's not the only thing the book talks about. Like it is life with God. So if God is the I am, God is the one who shows up and rescues people from slavery, then you free someone for something, right? And so he's describing, here's life with me. Here's the sacrifices that you must keep in order to maintain relationship. And then it moves right into ethics. So like, this is the kind of people you must be. So, I mean, some of the language for sure is old. Like some of the concepts we actually can't keep. We don't have boundary markers. We don't pass land down by family name in a very specific promised land, because we're not following the, land people blessing promises from Genesis. So there is a gap, like you feel it in Leviticus between their story, kind of if you're following the Simeon trust box, understanding their story and connecting to ours. But as I was kind of glancing ahead, looking through it, I was reminded, like God cares about the kind of people we are. And in that sense, their story, very similar to mine then. Like Lord willing, I'm a different person today than I was 10 years ago. And again, in a decade, if you look at me and if I'm the same dude, then I'm like, something was wrong. Like then I obviously didn't see God on the mountain, right? And for the Christian, I'm like, well, God is actually inside of you. So he's not on a mountain, he's in your heart. So yeah, you should be different. So I think as you read through Leviticus over this next month, don't view it as it's a bunch of stuff from someone else's story and weird laws about weird things. It's God directing his people. Here's who you are, and by necessity, then this is how you live. And some of that we for sure can borrow from and mimic in our day.
Yeah, and if you have questions on that, I know some people, it's one of those apologetic-y kind of questions, like why we don't follow all the laws, so why do we follow some of the laws, and how do we understand that? So we've done some work on that we could send you. We have like a little pamphlet or whatever 2-page thing on how the Old Testament and New Testament are combined that way, and what stays the same, what isn't the same. So if that's confusing to you, happy to help with that. It ends, the Old Testament section ends with Psalm 90 and 91, which is interesting because we jump into the Psalms, but that's because it is the psalm written by Moses, right? So it's the oldest psalm. It's not at the beginning of the Psalm book, because Psalm 1 starts with Psalm 1, which kind of sets the whole thing in motion. But Psalm 90 is written by Moses, and so that's why our month ends with that. Matthew. So we're going to continue Matthew and then go into Mark. So Dolly, tell us what we should think about as we start or end off Matthew and then go into the book of Mark. And just thinking specifically kind of how Mark is different than Matthew, style, audience, that kind of stuff.
Well, Matthew 21 starts with the last week of Jesus' life, from the triumphal entry up to his death and resurrection. So last week plus, because there's days after his resurrection as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I actually look forward to seeing what kind of connections there will be as we read the Old Testament Exodus parallel with this.
Right.
I think it's going to be interesting to see, the salvation story of of redeeming the people from slavery to our own salvation story of us being redeemed because of Christ's death and resurrection. So anyway, that's what I'm hoping for. So that's that. And then Mark, so it'll feel like, oh, now we're starting another gospel over. It'll feel like we're going backwards, but come with it with an eye of a different viewpoint, because he does write it differently. He writes more concisely and more like with more urgency. Like his words say, and then immediately he did this, and then they did that. So it's kind of like really jumpy. But it's a very interesting take as well, as we look at the first half of Mark, which again will be Christ up until his time of death and resurrection. So that will be the last half of Mark.
Yeah, we've got nothing before his ministry starts. Like basically,
Yeah, he
Mark
jumps
starts
right
with,
into ministry.
Jesus being baptized right away, and here we go. None of his birth
No
narratives.
childhood,
or,
no preparation.
No Christmas.
No.
Very sad.
Jesus is here to work. I love it.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, like the other thing about going through the Gospels in the next few months, because Mark is the second one, we will get a lot of different perspectives
Yes.
of Jesus, and as well, like always, the big focus will be his death and resurrection.
Yeah.
And we'll get to see different angles of that, and Mark does bring a different angle as well. So,
What do you know about his audience? Do you know much about Mark's audience, or if he was an eyewitness of Jesus?
well, Mark, that's the difference between Mark and Matthew. Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. Mark, we don't know for sure if he was an eyewitness. He may have at some points crossed paths, but he was a closer friend of Peter and a cousin of Barnabas, according to commentaries. So he was a secondary witness. He's not an eyewitness. But so his writings would be a lot more based on what Peter had said and what Peter experienced.
Right.
So that's why he made it into the Bible, because of that. And he would have been one of the companions of Paul on some of the missionary journeys as well, at least the first one. So he writes more to Christians, Gentiles, more of a Gentile audience, where Matthew is more to a Jewish audience. So there'll be differences in writing in that sense as well.
Yeah, Matthew's so much about, and this was done to fulfill the prophets,
Right.
to fulfill the scriptures. He's very much wanting to show the Jews that whatever happened was a
fulfillment
continuation
of
of
the
their
law.
story
Yeah.
and a fulfillment of it.
Yeah. So that would be the biggest difference between those two.
Yeah. So let's just talk generally about Gospels, because we're doing John then in our weekend service. So we got like three
That's
different
true.
Gospels going on.
I love it.
Yeah, Matthew in Bible study, and now Mark in Bible reading plan, John in the weekends. How do we understand different Gospel accounts all being true?
Well, one of the things that I think this is illustrative of is that like everyone wanted to know about Jesus.
Yeah.
So like one gospel wasn't enough. Like that probably Mark was the first one. And if you read commentators, someone will argue that there was, a fifth gospel that none of us have. And I'm like, doesn't really matter. We have the Bible God meant us to have. So, they start writing these stories, and as they're writing as inspired by the Spirit, according to 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, then you're like, well, there's more to say actually. And and John, it probably does the best job of showing his like purpose statement, and where at the end of his gospel he's like, well, I wrote these so that you would believe, and by believing have life in his name. So every single gospel writer is intended, like they are apologists, right? Like if you think of Andy Steiger's apologetics ministry, like we want to give people a good answer for the hope that is in us. So there were people like if they believed that Jesus was God, that he could save people from their sins, that he could give us eternal life, they want to share that story, and everyone wants to know that story. So then what you need is an authorized, if you can't get an autobiography, then you want like the biography from the dude who was there,
Right.
who followed him around. And that's what you have. You have apostolic authority in that these guys followed Jesus, walked with Jesus, or interviewed someone who did,
Yeah.
and they wrote everything down, and then everyone was still around. Like, people were still alive when these were written.
Well, that's the point too. Like, the eyewitnesses were starting to die off,
Totally.
right?
So
and
they
they
needed it.
needed something.
Yeah.
It's not the same age where we have a video of the original, right?
Which
It's
also accounts for some of the differences, right?
right, because it's a different focus, a different audience, a
Yeah.
different writer. So believers were scattered. So
Totally.
you would have a different emphasis as they wrote, different emphasis. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
like different vantage points, right?
Yeah.
Like it makes a difference, and you see kind of that desire. The faith was growing, right? Even in Mark writing, if he's a second generation Christian, like that they wanted to pass this on. They thought this story needed to be passed on.
Yeah, and John at the end of his gospel says like there would be like libraries full of books if everything was written about him. So everybody
Yeah.
had like, even I was trying to get a book. One of my friend's sons is really into World War II history, so I try to get like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer like kids kind of version.
Cool.
And like you look at Bonhoeffer biographies, and there's like 12 or 15. It's it's a biography, right? People are trying to write biographies of him, and they're all different. All of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer biography writers are going to choose different aspects to highlight, different stories they want to bring out for a certain purpose. That was the same with gospel writers. There's a scene in The Chosen, if you guys watch that show, where I think it's the beginning of season 2, the character who's John sits down and he says, well, I know Matthew, Mark, and Luke already told them all these things, so I'm going to write this. And it's
Yeah.
kind of that feeling like
Well,
they kind
yeah,
of knew what each
John-
other was writing, and
yeah.
his is so different.
his
yeah.
90% of his content is unique.
Right.
Yeah, compared to the other three, and that's why they're called the synoptics, because there is similar content there. But John, he was probably the last one to write, and would have come with a different perspective just because of that. Now years have passed. Now let me write so that people can believe.
Yeah.
So-
Fill in some of those other
Yeah.
details or whatever. Organize it a different way. Another example I heard that really helped me kind of think through this is that it's not a photo. People aren't getting photographs of Jesus, like you said. There wasn't video cameras.
Yeah.
But people are painting like a portrait. And when you paint a portrait of somebody, you kind of arrange materials, and you might have somebody looking wistfully in one direction. Like there's a pictures of Queen Elizabeth I often show at Bible study, where one's of her as a young woman and one's of her kind of in her crown and with a regal, all the regalia around her. They're both Queen Elizabeth. They're both true, but they're just emphasizing different aspects of who she is, about her role, about her function, and so I think the gospel writers are doing that too.
With words,
With words.
right,
They're
yep.
painting this portrait of who Jesus is as they encountered him. So anything else that you guys want to say about different accounts?
The portrait image, I think, is super helpful because it gives us an opportunity to see that different authors are emphasizing different things. They use slightly different language, but they're trying to accurately capture the story, right? So Matthew says kingdom of heaven rather than kingdom of God, not because he rejected the concept, but because he just speaks a slightly different way, right? And what we have in all of these authors is they're trying to capture, a 3-year public ministry and fit it into, the longest is 28 chapters. Like that's
Yeah.
not that much, right?
No.
If for those of you who still listen to Jeff Bucknam preaching, right? Like he uses a lot of the same stories, right? Like preachers do that. So Jesus walked around, there were always crowds. So what actually made it into the Bible? Well, it was at the discretion of the author. So then what we need to know, like, and again, this is where doctrine of scripture is super important. It wasn't just 4 dudes giving you like, here's what I think happened. They're interviewing people. And then the scripture teaches us God was in that process so that whatever they wrote down was what God wanted to be remembered. So it's not an autobiography. The Bible isn't, in the sense that God wrote it, but it is an autobiography in the sense that God is responsible for everything that came through it. So we have 4 gospels because God in his providence said, you need 4 gospels. There's 3 years of public ministry, and I want people like Mark and 3rd generation Christians like Timothy to believe. And, I don't know how many generations have passed since then to now, but Lord willing, there will be 1,000 generations of faithful Christian people that could trace their lineage all the way back to these apostles and people who actually saw Jesus, and then eventually we'll all see him face to face.
And to put it to today as well, I've heard of testimonies of people who have come to faith through a different gospel. One will be like, oh, Mark impacted me, and the other one will be John. So even for us today, it impacts us each individually and differently,
Yeah.
which is the cool thing about
Well,
Scripture.
and to that too, like I've heard stories similar where maybe you're trying to disciple somebody or introduce them to just what is Christianity anyways, and Mark being the one we're jumping into, it's shorter. It's a lot of the summarizing of Jesus' ministry, so people have used it to be like, hey, come along and read this with me, because it's not a long commitment. You're not going through. I mean, there's still obviously going to be complex questions and stuff you have to dive into, but has been useful to disciple people at their earliest stages in maybe a way that wouldn't resonate with other people because John's got too much imagery or Matthew's too long or Luke's too technical. So there's definitely ways to think about it in terms of reaching people with the story for the first time.
Yeah, we all know that we connect differently with different kinds of writing and different kinds of speakers too, right? And so this gives a variety to that. So yeah, well, we are going to sign off for now, but wish you all the best as you read in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Matthew, and Mark in the month of February. Take care.